Well, Georgia's in play because the public opinion polls suggest that Vice President Harris is doing better than President Biden was when he was the candidate. So Joe Biden could still make the claim that most polls had him within the statistical margin of error of Joe Biden,
Hmm.
of Donald Trump, excuse me. But the trajectory was headed in the wrong direction. And it was very likely because there were some polls that were indicating it in June that there were going to be more polls where Donald Trump was going to be clearly ahead of Joe Biden. So statistically outside of double what the margin of error was. Since Kamala Harris has entered the race, there have been a couple of polls that have suggested that she's ahead, but all of these polls put Biden or Harris and Trump within a couple of percentage points of each other, which is clearly a statistical tie. So that suggests that Georgia is still in play. Now, that being said, Georgia still has more Republicans than Democrats in the state. And so if Kamala
Hmm.
Harris wants to win the state, she's got to have a massive mobilization campaign that does better than Donald Trump's machine does and gets every possible Democratic voter out. And so what that means is you cannot just concentrate on Atlanta and think you've done your job. You've got to find Democratic voters wherever they are. And the truth is that they're all over the state, and Atlanta isn't the
Hmm.
only blue spot in the state of Georgia.
Well, and when we consider who those Democratic voters actually are, who they might be, it is, of course, worth noting that Georgia does have one of the highest Black populations of any state in the country. How much of what Harris needs to do is appeal to that demographic specifically when they were not as supportive of Joe Biden, it seemed, in this cycle than they were in 2020?
Yeah, if you don't have strong support amongst African American voters, so that's not just in terms of vote choice, the percentage of Black voters who support the Democratic ticket, but it's also in terms of voter turnout, you're doomed to failure because Black voters make up more than half of all Democratic voters in the state of Georgia. So you have to have that strong base of support, and then you have to build on it. So that does include college educated liberals in the metro Atlanta suburbs. That includes Latino voters who are spread across the state and might not necessarily be in the urban centers in the state. That includes Asian American voters in the suburbs. And so, this idea that you have to campaign across the whole state and make sure that you overperform everywhere is going to be the ticket to Kamala Harris being able to win the state. If she can't do this, then she's not going to win the state.
Well, so let's talk then about her opponent who could win the state. Donald Trump, of course, was within 12,000 votes roughly of Joe Biden in 2020, but ultimately lost it. Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, who has had some difficulty with his relationship with Donald Trump, or maybe it's Donald Trump who's having difficulty navigating the Kemp relationship, Andra, given what went down in 2020. Brian Kemp is obviously a very popular figure in Georgia, and that's borne out in polling we're seeing just today. How do we need to consider that relationship and what Donald Trump needs to do in regard to Brian Kemp to get those who might support him, Kemp, the governor in Georgia, on Donald Trump's side?
Well, the issue with Donald Trump's ire was is he was lashing out publicly against somebody whose political machine he needs in order to be able to win the state. And so many people argue that it was self-defeating for Donald Trump to, 4 years later, and even 2 years after his own gubernatorial candidate lost to Brian Kemp in the primaries, it didn't make sense for Trump to continually attack Brian Kemp, who was a popular governor in the state. So we've seen a rapprochement. Brian Kemp is still a Republican. He's still probably going to support the Republican ticket regardless of what happens to in his relationship with Donald Trump. And many of us in Georgia think that he harbors higher political aspirations for the U.S. Senate. So he wouldn't want to alienate the Trump base, who he's going to want to support him in a Republican primary. And so what we see here is just a pragmatic meeting of the minds. Brian Kemp is going to support Donald Trump. He's fundraising for him, and he's going to avail former President Trump of his mobilization operation. And again, this is because whichever side does the best job of getting their people out is going to be the one to win. And so Republicans still have a margin in the state. They still have a buffer, but it's not as big as it used to be. So you cannot have lackluster turnout amongst Republicans and expect to be guaranteed a victory in the state in the way that you might have been able to bank on that 20 years ago.
Well, I did catch up with Governor Kemp at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee earlier this summer, who did make it clear that he is supporting Donald Trump. He wants him to win Georgia, but has said then and said repeatedly even now that there is really no real path for Donald Trump to win if he doesn't win Georgia. How should we be considering the map here? The way it has expanded, Andra, it seems, for Kamala Harris to some of these Sun Belt states, Georgia inclusive, and how now that may shift strategies for both campaigns, Trump included.
Well, I mean, so if we think about the wall and we think about the seven competitive states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, the Sun Belt states actually contribute fewer electoral college votes to the margins. And so most analysts assume that Donald Trump has already banked about 219 electoral college votes. Georgia has 16 of those votes. It shares second place in terms of being the largest share of votes of any of these remaining battleground states. So North Carolina is certainly in play. He would need both of those and Arizona and Nevada to be able to get over the hump to 270 electoral college votes. That's assuming that Kamala Harris wins the Rust Belt states. So, it's Donald Trump's path to victory will probably almost by necessity require that he win 5 states. Pennsylvania is always going to be the plum prize because it's the largest of those states. And if you win Pennsylvania, then if you win the larger states, you can take 4 of those states. But if Arizona is going to be part of this discussion, then and if Nevada is going to be part of this discussion in terms of a must-win state, that actually probably puts the probability of needing 5 states in order to be able to carry the math.
Yeah, Andra, I caught up on this show yesterday with Laura Trump, the co-chair of the RNC, who told me that she does see margins tightening in the state of Pennsylvania, and they're considering investing more resources in that state as a result. I do want to talk as well, before we let you go, Andra, about the interview that Harris and Walz will be sitting down for together within the next hour. It will, of course, air this evening. What is it that Kamala Harris is going to need to most answer for in this interview for Georgians and voters who may not yet be decided whether or not they want to vote for her, and frankly, undecided voters in these key states across the board?
Well, she's been attacked a lot about flip-flopping on issues, so she's going to have to explain her evolution on issues, and it's going to have to be credible. The big thing that she's going to have to do is she's going to have to speak clearly and not make gaffes and present herself as relatable and ready to lead. I think this is still very much going to be a campaign about vibes, in part because character, I think, can be characterized as a vibe issue about how candidates are going to make you feel. And so she's going to have to present that case as well. But basically, she's going to have to present herself as being able to handle tough questions, questions that she hasn't seen before, so that she can counter the Republican argument that she's slippery and that she's basically kind of, a shadow type of candidate who really has no substance behind her.
Just really quickly, Andra, obviously we here at Bloomberg TV and radio want to focus on policy. Policy specifically is where our interest lies, and we're hoping maybe we'll get answers from Kamala Harris on some of that tonight. But is it going to be about policy in this election, or can someone actually win on vibes alone?
I Part of the issue with vibes is making sure that you're conveying empathy and that you understand the problems that the average American voter faces. And so you are going to have to name check issues. I think it becomes a question of how much detail do you need to provide in order to be convincing. And so I don't necessarily know that all voters are going to be looking at white papers and they're going to be looking at the specificity of policies, but they do want to hear that you've thought about some issues and that you have some reasonable ideas for how to tackle those issues and that you can communicate that effectively.